Hello everyone, I'm Charlotte from MDPI and I will be your host for today. Thank you for joining our latest MDPI webinar entitled New Approaches to Evaluate Researchers' Impact. The webinar is organised within the framework of the second Basel Sustainable Publishing Forum, which will be held virtually on the 26th and 27th of October 2020. Registration for the conference is now open and we would be very pleased if you could join us. I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is recorded. The recording will be made available as soon as possible and will be posted on the webinar's webpage. The webinar is also being live streamed on MDPI's YouTube channel, so hello to those who are watching us on there. Today's webinar is moderated by Professor Ed Constable from University of Basel, Switzerland. Thank you, Ed, for accepting to moderate this webinar. And there will be 3 presentations given by Professor Silvio Peroni from University of Bologna, Professor Ludo Waltman from Leiden University, and Professor Stefanie Haustein from University of Ottawa. Their talks will be followed by a Q&A and discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And please make sure to mention the speaker to whom you're asking the question. And now I hand the floor over to Ed. Enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte. And I would like to take this opportunity to welcome all of the participants who have joined this webinar today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here on what in Europe is a beautiful sunny afternoon. Today we have the second of the webinars in this series on sustainable publishing. And in contrast to the first event of this nature, we are now concentrating upon the downstream aspects of sustainable publishing. So not the direct impact in terms of the implementation of open access, but the impact upon the academic system and in particular the means of assessment in a world that is moving towards open science and open access. I think that we're all aware that in the last 6 months, the world has been a interesting and strange place, and that in the context of doctoral training, we have had to wake up and very rapidly consider new ways of evaluation of research output and research attainment. In particular, where access to libraries or access to laboratories has been restricted. And so we've had to revise the criteria we're using in assessment. In that sense, it explains maybe why I'm here, because as a professor of chemistry, I would not be expected to be in the mainstream of this area, but in a previous incarnation, I was also Vice President of the University of Basel and directly concerned with doctoral education and also with the implementation of the open access strategies. So I think that the theme of today's meeting, New Approaches to Evaluate Researchers' Output, is extremely topical. It's very broad, from the doctoral level to early career researchers, right through the academic progression and also outside the academic area. It's a topic which is actively discussed in many fora. For example, the European Universities Association is also very active in this area. And I think that we have 3 excellent speakers today, Silvio Peroni, Ludo Waltman, and Stefanie Haustein, who will address different aspects of this downstream effect of the new modalities, both the implementation and the evaluation. I think it's certainly fair to say that the change in publishing modalities is creating new challenges as well as creating new opportunities, that there is now a very general acceptance that the way that we have classically done bibliometric analysis is no longer fit for purpose and is not the way that we should be recommending in the future. I'm very pleased to see that Stefanie is addressing what I consider to be the major issue, and that is one of acceptance. There is within the peer review process a conservatism and a reluctance to change from the tried and tested methods of bibliometric analysis. And that is something that we have to consider. We probably know what should be done, but how do we persuade the university management systems that this needs to be implemented in the closed room peer review processes? The session will finish with a question and answers. And if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will see a Q&A box there. So please place your questions there, and assuming that I am not totally overwhelmed with the flood of questions, I will attempt to moderate those and maybe group them together if I see the same question multiple times. I think I've said most of what I want to say. I think that the acceptance issue is the principal barrier that we have. And I think, again, we are all aware that there are some disciplines who still use the cumulative impact factor of a journal as a bibliometric criterion, which says probably nothing about the candidate and everything about the publisher. And so I suspect we'll hear questions relating to that. So it now gives me very great pleasure to introduce the first of the afternoon's speaker. This is Professor Silvio Peroni, who is an assistant professor at the University of Bologna in Italy. He is at the Department of Classical Philology and Italian Studies. And at least in a European context, where better could one start than Bologna, the first university in Europe. He is also a developer of the SPAR ontologies. He is co-director of Open Citations and co-founder of I4OC. So with that, I hand the microphone and the screen to Silvio, and we look forward to his presentation, which is entitled History of Open Citations, What They Are and Why They Are Crucial for Metrics-Based Research Assessment. Silvio.
Thank you, Ed, for the kind introduction. So I would like to start with a quotation, if I may, quotation made by from an article written by David Sutton in 2013 entitled Publishing Open Citation, where he said explicitly that the fact that reference lists of journals are not free available for any use by all scholars is a scandal within the scholarly communication domain. I know David since 2010. I was so lucky that during my PhD, I spent 6 months of my research in his laboratory in Oxford, where we started to talk about to what then became, let's say, open citation, semantic publishing technologies and these things. And so I know very well the origin of that frustration that David had about that specific problem. And the goal of my presentation today is just to introduce the steps that brought us there and what it has happened next, that specific period when open citation started to get consensus in the community. Contextualizing the situation, I would like to put this talk in the context of well-known crisis in science that is known with the name of replication crisis or reproducibility crisis, which is basically the fact that a lot of studies that have been published are not reproducible. Basically, we cannot reproduce the result because we don't have clean and clearly stated methods that have been used to produce these results, and either we don't have the data for reproducing them and these kind of things. Now, this is a kind of crisis in the whole branch of sciences, but affects also the methods that we are currently used to assess research. So here the critics is not only to the recipes, so let's say the processes that we use for evaluating research and to do research assessment exercise, but also to the lack of transparency in the ingredients that are needed for this recipe to be run. So the data, in this case, the data that we use to compute the outcomes of the research assessment exercises. So we urge, I believe, a global community effort in the scholarly communication domain, at least, to put these data that are used for computing these metrics, these indicators, that often these data are just representing pure facts, like citations, and as such, they cannot be copyrightable, even if they are indeed currently available only by means of paywalled services that will cost a lot of money for accessing them. And we need to move all together in order to claim back this data and to put them in the public domain as where they should stay, basically. So here, in this context, when I refer to open citations, I can mean, from one perspective, to see citations as common good that can be used by anyone for any reasons. However, the concept of open citation is strongly tied with that of the web, with the creation of all the technologies that allowed the existence of the web as we know today. So it's a quite well-known story. In 1989, the web was basically created for the very first time, and it was kind of success that take a lot of supporters during the next years. The web technologies since then have been used by several different actors. In particular, they changed drastically how we publish in general, how we share content with others, and of course this kind of revolution affected also academic publishing. A lot of standards, guidelines, services have been developed in the past using web technologies, and that with the intent of improving, let's say, the discoverability of the products of academic research, being them publication, data sets, software, whatsoever, and to improve also research practices. Open citations as a term were born in this context. So they are strongly based on web standards. But the point is, usually, the usual question that I got a lot of times is, yes, but what is an open citation? Why an open citation is different from a citation? What are the main differences between these things? So to introduce in a better way what I mean with open citation, is good to have first a definition of what I mean for a citation. So in this context, a citation is a conceptual directional link from a citing entity to a cited entity. So looking at the diagram in the slides, when I talk about a citation, I mean the whole thing. So the arrow that defines the links between the citing entity and the cited entity, and the citing entity and cited entity themselves. Citation data that relates to a particular citation then must necessarily include a representation of such conceptual directional link. So there should be a way to define that link somehow, and also must include basic metadata that allow you to identify somehow the citing entity and the cited entity, such as the title of a paper, their authors, the date of publication, the venue, the identifiers of the papers, and these kind of things. So we talk that a bibliographic citation can be defined as an open citation if these data that define this open citation are compliant with 5 specific points. The data are structured, separate, open, identifiable, and available. With these terms, we mean that the data are structured, that they are kind of offered and exposed in a machine readable format in order to be processable easily by machines. Separate is that we can get citation data without necessarily having the access to the source paper, source article that define this data there. Open means that this citation data must be available without restriction in order to maximize reuse. In addition to that, the citing and cited entities must be clearly identifiable by means of persistent identifier, for instance, or eventually by URLs within the web context. And finally, that I can use the HTTP protocol, which is one of the technologies defined by the web, plus the persistent identifier to get the metadata of the citing or cited entity. So these are the characteristics that an open citation must have to be called open in this context. However, this definition was provided quite recently, but in the past, we observed specific historical milestones, let's say, that started implicitly to talk about open citation without mentioning all these characteristics, at least not directly. And to me, the first introduction of open citation is kind of defined in Robert Cameron's article published in 1997, in which he described what he called, or well, speculates at least, the existence of what he called the universal citation database. And this database, the main characteristics of this database are those ones that I listed here, that it is able to contain links between all the scholarly works that have been written in the past, which is freely available on the internet, which is updated every day, which is comprehensive. So there is no prior selection of the venues that are acceptable to be included in the database. The database includes just all the links that exist between scholarly works. That includes also any kind of publication, not only journal articles or conference proceedings, but also working papers, preprints, and in principle also data sets, software, and these kind of things. That this kind of database allow basically to have all publication equally visible in the system, even if they are not necessarily accessible. So not all the publication are open access, but at least I provide a kind of place where they can be found following the citation links and the evolution of science that is traced by means of this link. And in addition, that this kind of citation database, in order to keep it scalable, should be decentralized. So it's not a monolithic architecture, but should be somehow organized in a way that can be decentralized in multiple nodes within the internet, within the web. So this is, to me, where we really started to talk about this matter, about this topic of open citations. And starting from that specific period, so the web, and after the web, the Universal Citation Database, things started to happen. In the same year, CiteSeer, that was a new citation index that was created totally automatically by crawling postscript version of the articles available on the web, was created, and was just the same year of the Universal Citation Database article. A few years after, Sitebase was another tentative of providing a free citation index by processing all the preprints available in the archive project, which is still there today. And after a few years again, there was the first version of Google Scholar, which actually, even if you cannot access directly to the data, provided a first clearly open interface for looking at a paper of a scientist and the citation that these papers received in past. There was, in 2006, the evolution of CiteSeer, called CiteSeer X, where they tried to change the data model in order to address some problem that come up about the scaling of the data that I have. Then it happened something that to me is the first, let's say, that define the deflection of this arrow, let's say, the very first time, that is the introduction of semantic publishing technology. Semantic publishing technology actually is the application of a very simple concept. So semantic web technologies that have been basically released at the end in 1996 for the very first time, but applying these technologies to the scholarly publishing domain and trying to start first experiments by using structured format for defining additional semantics to define additional data around journal articles, conference proceedings, and these kind of things that brought basically David Shupton to obtain a grant from JISC from a project called Open Citations Project, which aimed to develop a corpus of citation data entirely available on the web by using URL as way to identify the resources, and by using RDF as format for exposing this data to the public. This was a kind of milestone, is where all the characteristics that I've introduced before about what does it mean to be an open citation start to appear concretely with the meaning that we have today. And David promoted that project in the conference of the Association of Open Access Publishers in 2013. And that very idea of having open citation is then, let's say, introduced again by Dario Terrabolelli, at that time was working at Wikimedia Foundation, at another conference of the International Association of Open Access Publishers in 2016. There, that point is the turning point to me, is where things started to change somehow from a small, if you want, research project. Open citation get a kind of broader audience, and that was by means to me of two different things. Two specific prototypes, let's say, started to be advertised on the web. One is Open Citations, the organization, the infrastructure where I'm involved as director, where we started to publish millions of citations available on the web that can be reused for any purpose using semantic web technologies. And the other one is the beginning of a movement within the Wikimedia Foundation radar, which is called Wikisite, which aimed at adding bibliographic metadata and citation information to Wikidata, this great database that the Wikimedia Foundation made available for all to be populated and to be used. After that first technical implementation, in 2017, something happened that had a great impact in the scholarly community, in particular with publishers, which was the Initiative for Open Citation. After the talk by Dario, a lot of people, a bunch of people, honestly, 10, 15 people started to talk about how to liberate citations from the paywalled world, let's say. And we noticed that there was already an infrastructure, there was Crossref that actually stored those citations already made available by publisher, but they were not publicly available to all because by default, they weren't. That's the only point. So Crossref already had the information, but couldn't expose this information for all by means of their API. So this bunch of people that formed the Initiative for Open Citation actually started to ask to a lot of publishers, including very big players, to look, you are already depositing this information. The reference list of your article are already deposited in Crossref. Why you don't open it for the benefit of all? And this kind of initiative worked quite well, since we passed from a very small, a tiny amount of reference list available on Crossref to a quite huge amount that now currently counts more than 50 million articles having references that are totally available on Crossref, that also include reference lists open and to be reused by all for any possible reason. And starting from that period, a lot of events and interest also by funders started around the open citation world. There were a bunch of workshops that were meaningful. The Wikisite workshop in 2017 and the workshop on open citation in 2018 that started to advertise to a broader community about what was happening around open citation. And starting from that time, there was a kind of increment of interest and in projects and in services that offer open citations according to the definition that I've provided before to the community, to the public, for any use and for any purpose. So this is a kind of brief history of what happened in the past 30 years, basically, around the world of open citations. Why they are important for research metrics, and in particular for assessment of research. As you know, the open science movement took a kind of first stage in the past years. It is a movement that has been discussed by a lot of policy documents, and the principle behind open science are now the gold standard for doing a responsible and good research, basically. There is just to mention some of those, there is a wonderful policy document made available by the French Ministry of Education a few years ago, where they basically claim that the assessment system for researchers and institutions must be mandatorily based on open science principle and practice in order to make them fine for what the community expect. And related to this particular policy document and to this specific aspect of assessment, other two policy documents have been released in the past year that talk exactly about that. Those are the Declaration of Research on Research Assessment, DORA, and the Leiden Manifesto for Research Metrics. Both of them in their text talk about the necessity of having open and transparent data for the research assessment and methods for calculating the various metrics and indicators that then will be used in research assessment exercises. In addition to that, actually DORA explicitly stressed the fact that the data that are used to compute these metrics must be free of any possible constraint. They should allow unrestricted reuse, and in addition to that, they should be made available in order to be accessed computationally. That means also that the format should be machine readable, and also if there are services that allow an easy access to this data from a computational point of view, like software, that will improve their reuse. These needs of having basically free and public domain data for calculating this kind of metrics is also necessary in order to allow people to verify the data that are used for compute metrics and then to assess research and the analysis used for doing that assessment. Not only the people that are involved, so that are evaluated by the particular system, but anyone that could be interested in looking at the fairness of the whole process from the data to the analysis itself. The bad news about that is that paywalled and closed citation data that usually today are used by national assessment exercise do not comply with the following principles. Indeed, actually, they are a sort of threat to transparency, replicability, and verifiability of the research assessment exercise. And this is exactly a situation that must change. And this is why open citation data are important, and we have to convince the community to fight together in order to have them as soon as possible available to be used in this kind of assessment exercise. Here it's important. Now there are a bunch of infrastructure that made available open citation data. I just briefly described the infrastructure where I am directly involved, that is Open Citations. Open Citation is a community guided infrastructure organization where we publish open citation data in CC0. I say that is a community guided because we have two specific organs, that is the Open Citation Council and the Open Citation Advisory Board, that includes members from the scholarly community, and that guide somehow the governance of the infrastructure itself in order to be sure that we are doing the right thing. Any institution can help Open Citation to publish more data, to collect more data in two different ways that are not mutually exclusive. So you can even do both. The first one is to support Open Citation financially, becoming member. There are different levels of membership. All the levels allow the members to be part of the council that is in charge of electing candidates to serve on the International Advisory Board, so allowed to guide what are the people, the most suitable people to govern this open infrastructure for the goal of releasing open citation. And a specific membership that is a strategic one actually allow an institution to have a seat on the International Advisory Board, which means to take part to the governance of open citation. Of course, to be part of the board, one should have anyway the approval of the International Advisory Board in order to be sure that the principle that the let's say candidate member for having a seat in the International Advisory Board are compliant with the open science principle. In addition to that, institution can provide citation data to us, and we will be very happy to include this data in our dumps and then to publish them available for all and make them available with the services that we have, like REST API, that allow basically this data to be integrated in existing applications like visualization application, digital libraries, and these kind of things. Recently, just as a support of the importance of this topic, SCOS explicitly selected us together with other infrastructure, OEP and DOAB and PKP, as in an infrastructure that deserve support from the community from a financial point of view, which is was a great success for us, since it has been done by mainly 2 people and a bunch of collaborators in the past 5 years, the whole work of organizing open citation and the data that we publish. And so it was a kind of award for us, this selection by SCOS. Now, just a few words to concluding my talk. What I want to say to all the people there, all the institutions there, is that you can make a real difference in the process of reaching transparent, replicable, and verifiable metric-based research assessment. It's not true that we are tied to the current world of paywall data. We can do something. We can make the difference. We can provide open citation data, open scholarly metadata in general that can be used for the same purposes, but we can provide them to the public in order to be used for any possible purposes, not only research assessment. And you can be part of what Cameron in 1997, in that article that he published, called Reforming Scholarly Communication. And you can be part of that reform by supporting infrastructure that aims at developing this universal citation database that Cameron envisioned. So the point here is that alone we cannot do anything here, but if we work together to reach that goal, we can really improve how metric-based research assessment works today. So what is my prayer to all of you is to support infrastructure that offer open citations, open scholarly metadata, to support open citation, and by doing so, to support open science. And that was my last slide. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that stimulating and slightly controversial presentation. I hope that this will be followed up in the question and answer session at the end. I would like to remind the attendees that there is at the bottom of the Zoom screen a maybe not so familiar icon for the Q&A, and this is where you can put questions to be addressed to the panelists. And can I make a request that, as I'm going to be reading these very quickly, that you identify which of the panelists your question is primarily for, although of course all panelists can answer. So now it gives me pleasure to move to the second of our presentations from Professor Ludo Waltman. His presentation is entitled Beyond Metrics, Interactive Visualizations for Responsible Research Evaluation. Ludo is Professor of Quantitative Science Studies at University of Leiden, and he completed his doctoral studies at the University of Rotterdam. And the floor is now, or rather the screen is now yours, Ludo.
Hey, thank you, Ed, and good afternoon, everyone. So what I would like to talk about is the idea of basically moving beyond metrics. So many of us probably, when we discuss research evaluation, immediately think about metrics, or sometimes we say indicators, numbers, statistics, and there's a lot that can be said about that. And many of us often do so, also in a critical way. We often complain about metrics. We feel uneasy about metrics. I sometimes feel uneasy about them. I also think they have a lot of value. But today I would like to discuss how we can move beyond metrics, in particular by using so-called interactive visualizations, and how this will enable us to do research evaluation in a responsible manner. So this is the Leiden Manifesto that actually was already mentioned by Silvio in the previous presentation. So it's a statement on principles for responsible research assessment. The first principle is quantitative evaluation should support qualitative expert assessment. This is a key idea that many experts in this area are strongly promoting. So we have all kinds of quantitative approaches that can be used for research assessment. In particular, we have metrics, and they definitely have value, but they should be used to support qualitative expert assessment. So they should not, on their own, quantitative approaches, they should not basically decide the outcomes of a research assessment. Instead, they should support expert judgment. That is a key idea that many people are promoting. At the same time, it's not so obvious what this really means, how we can really implement and realize this idea. And I would like to say a bit more about that today. This is going on at the moment in the Netherlands. We have a so-called recognition and rewards initiative, which is an initiative that has been taken by our Association of Universities in the Netherlands. So it's an initiative supported directly by all the universities, also by our national research funder, for instance. And this initiative aims to reform the way in which we think about basically recognition and reward, or about assessing researchers. So for instance, what it says is the following. It says that we need a broader perspective and a different culture where quality is more important than quantity, a culture in which other skills receive recognition and rewards. So not just quantity, not just the things that can easily be counted, and also a culture where we associate a professor's title with more than the two narrow indicators of the number of publications and the number of large grants. So we have, of course, what we see here is all kinds of ideas that are being discussed in many places in the world, ideas on metrics, and perhaps why metrics can be dangerous if we focus too narrowly on just a few numbers. What we also see, and that is perhaps what makes the Dutch case interesting, is we see that at the national level, the universities, the research community at large, have embraced these ideas and have taken the initiative to think about ways in which we can move beyond, let's say, an excessive reliance on numbers and on metrics. And at my center, at Leiden University, at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, we are part of this discussion on how this can be done. We participate in that discussion, and we also promote particular approaches that could be taken to actually implement these ideas of moving towards more responsible research assessment. So one idea that we have developed is the idea of a methodology that we call evaluative inquiry. So a number of colleagues of mine are actually leading this effort. So this is a blog post that they published recently where they present some of the underlying ideas of this methodology, evaluative inquiry. So what we see is the following. This methodology emphasizes on the one hand that there is value in bibliometric methodologies, so in quantitative approaches. So these approaches can be used to get insight into for instance, co-authorship relations, citation scores, feasibility in journals. That can all be very valuable, but at the same time, my colleagues also emphasize the importance of, for instance, using interviews and focus group discussions to get a more fine-grained understanding of the context within which research takes place. And then the important idea is that the insights of one method can corroborate or even dispute claims made by another method. And together, the different methods, quantitative and qualitative, they reinforce, they strengthen each other, and they, in the end, should lead to more responsible research assessment and, of course, ultimately to better decision making. So that's basically the promise, and that's what we are trying to realize by developing these types of methodologies. So today I will kind of zoom in on one particular aspect that I believe is kind of an essential element in realizing this ambition. So this pyramid shows how we usually move from data to decisions in a, of course, extremely simplified way. So when we take a quantitative approach, we start perhaps at the bottom of the pyramid with things like all kinds of information, all kinds of data about research activities, research outputs, for instance, information about publications, about citations. Sometimes this data is openly available, as discussed by Silvio. Sometimes we must get it from data sources that are not open, that are proprietary, closed. This data can then in all kinds of ways be aggregated, be summarized. We may create lists, we may create tables, we may perhaps aggregate a bit more by creating charts or visualizations. And in many cases, of course, what we do is we aim for the ultimate way of bringing all the information together and summarizing it in just one single number. So then we have a metric or an indicator. In practice, often we don't aim for just one metric, and one key idea that many people support is that we should, at least when we use metrics, we should have multiple metrics so that we can provide information on different aspects of, for instance, the performance of researchers, the performance of research institutions. But this is how we move in a quantitative approach, in a bibliometric approach, how we move from the data that we have, so the bottom of the pyramid, to, in the end, all kinds of ways of summarizing that data, either in numerical metrics or in other things like visualizations, tables, etc. At the left, we see a different approach that can be taken. And that, of course, you're also familiar with. We again start with basically the same types of information, but this information is, for instance, summarized in a curriculum vitae, or this information is kind of discussed in an interview with, for instance, applicants for a job. We have panel discussions where different experts actually have a discussion among each other about what should really matter, what should really count in a particular situation, and how different candidates, how they perform based on these criteria. The outcomes of such a discussion may be written down in an assessment report, and in the end, at the top of the pyramid, this may be translated into specific recommendations. So let's give funding to that person or to that research proposal, or let's not give funding. Let's make a ranking of the applicants for a particular job in the order of preference. So we see two different approaches which both have strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons. So the quantitative approach is objective in some sense. It is fast. It is also, of course, extremely reductionistic. It leaves out a lot of important information. And that's also why so many people are critical about quantitative approaches, because of all the information that is left out, all the information that cannot easily be quantified. That's one of the big dangers of relying too strongly on a quantitative approach. So the qualitative approach is, well, takes more effort. It's probably a bit slower. Some people complain about this approach being subjective. It does have an important strength. It is contextualized. So the way you think about an assessment can be really, can be tailored to the specific situation that you are dealing with, and it can be customized to all the peculiarities of that particular setting that you are dealing with, and that's much more difficult in the quantitative approach that you see at the right. The big challenge, I believe, is to think about ways in which these two approaches, so the qualitative at the left and the quantitative at the right, in which they can be brought together, can be combined. Ideally, actually, you want to fully integrate them. And that is something we are trying to accomplish, for instance, in this evaluative inquiry approach that I just mentioned. One piece of the puzzle actually is to make sure that when you take a quantitative approach, when you make use of metrics, which I think is really useful in many cases, it's a way to quickly get, quickly process a lot of information and to quickly get certain insights that may then deserve a deeper examination. When you do so, a key idea is that it should always be possible to see what is behind your numbers. So you have these metrics, you have these numbers, but it should always be possible to see what is behind them. And this is where the visualizations come in, where the visualizations that I would like to discuss today, where they play an essential role, because visualizations are a way to still provide a summary of a lot of underlying information, but to do so in a way that is more pluralistic, that allows for more nuance, and that also hopefully offers a way to connect the more quantitative approaches to research assessment with all kinds of qualitative considerations, with, for instance, the way experts have discussions in panels or with job applicants in interviews. So I will now demonstrate a few approaches to visualization, just to hopefully make this point that metrics can be helpful. They may be really useful in some cases, but we should always be able to see what is behind the numbers, and the visualizations are so helpful for that. So these are journal metrics, of course, quite relevant in the context of publishing or sustainable publishing. We know them, we complain a lot about them, about impact factors and other metrics, but of course we also use them a lot, even though we may not always feel happy about that. So one argument that has been made is that these numbers can be too deceptive, and we should, if we use them at all, we should complement them with distributions that show what is actually behind these numbers. So the underlying distributions, for instance, behind an impact factor. So citation distributions, that's what you see here at the right. I took this from the website of Nature. So they do this. They publish not only on their website their impact factor, but they also publish the underlying distribution, which, for instance, shows that the distribution is really highly skewed. So the impact factor is determined primarily by just a few very highly cited publications. That's an important point, and the visualization of the distribution provides a reminder of this point. This is another example. We tend to look at citations, citation count, citation metrics. We may also take a deeper a closer look at citations, and we may actually explore what is going on in citation networks. So we see two tools here, Citation Network Explorer at the left and Citation Gecko at the right. And both of these tools allow us to make use of citation data, but not to obtain one-dimensional numerical metrics, but to actually explore how individual publications or individual authors, how they have an influence on other people and other colleagues in the field. And this, of course, gives a much deeper understanding of the notion of scientific influence that many of us believe is what is more or less captured by citations. This is another example. The actual content of the research. So what actually is the research about? Here we see so-called term maps. So they show terms that have been extracted from the titles and abstracts of publications. And that shows us, it gives us a kind of high-level summary of what the research done by a particular researcher, a particular research unit, what it is actually about. So this is actually the research done by university medical centers in the Netherlands. So we see the main terms used in their publications. And we can then also, for instance, make comparisons. So at the left, we see the Leiden University Medical Center. We see how it focuses on particular areas, which are highlighted in red. At the right, we do the same for one of the other university medical centers in the Netherlands. And we see that they have a completely different focus. So we can now start to have discussions, not just about who is doing better, but we can start to have discussions about how different institutions differ from each other in terms of what they are actually doing. And that's, of course, a different type of discussion, and a discussion that might sometimes be more important to have than just a discussion about who is doing better. So this is a research landscape. This shows actually all the publications in a particular database in a particular time period, all fields of science. And within such a research landscape, you can show all kinds of information. You can, for instance, look at where is artificial intelligence research? Where can we find this within the overall landscape of science? And this is an important tool, for instance, when we want to discuss interdisciplinarity, when we want to discuss how different types of research areas, how they are brought together. So artificial intelligence, where does it take place? Research into AI. Does it take place in computer science? How does it connect to the social sciences? These types of things can be made visible in these types of visualizations. And this allows us to really have proper discussions about interdisciplinarity and the way in which different disciplines might be brought together. Another idea is actually not just counting citations, but thinking about what they actually mean. So do they indicate support? Do they indicate disagreement? Sometimes people use machine learning techniques for this. It's a bit controversial because it creates black boxes, but you can also do it visually. You can show how in different research fields people may or may not have all kinds of disagreements. So here you see, for instance, at the right, you see actual citing sentences in individual publications, and you see how these citing sentences indicate controversy in science. So these are citations that do not simply indicate that one publication is influenced by another publication. It actually indicates that one publication disagrees with another publication. So this is again a way to look behind the numbers. In the interest of time, I will skip this. What is going to happen next is basically that we see more and more of these tools, these visualization tools that give this much deeper insight. So some of you may know that I'm one of the developers of the PhosViewer tool. We are also continuing the development of our tool, for instance, making it web-based so that it can be integrated into all kinds of other platforms and so that it can be linked to underlying data sources in a really streamlined way. And hopefully this will enable all of us together to realize this ambition of responsible research evaluation by combining qualitative and quantitative approaches, by enabling people to always dig deeper into the data and to see what is behind the numbers that we have. And this is hopefully what the visualizations will be able to contribute to. That's it. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Ludo. Just looking at the Q&A session, I see that has already stimulated a lot of interest in the attendees. So I'm looking forward to the session at the end. So now it's my pleasure to, sorry, I've just lost this screen. I need it. To introduce our third panelist of the afternoon. This is Professor Stefanie Haustein. Her presentation is entitled Metrics Literacies on the Importance of Educating Researchers and Administrators about the Appropriate Use of Scholarly Metrics. I think that's a theme that has already come up. Stefanie is Assistant Professor in the School of Information Studies at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and commenced her academic career at the University of Düsseldorf in Germany. So Stefanie, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for the introduction and also for the invitation to be here. First, I was quite worried that my presentation was going to be the odd one out, but it turns out it fits in really well because there are a lot of issues that both Silvio and Ludo already brought up that I want to focus on. So I want to talk to you today about metrics literacies and why I think it's really important that we don't only produce metrics and produce open metrics and are transparent about it, but we actually educate researchers from all fields and also research administrators like funders or research admins and managers on how to appropriately use them. So I think that that's the topic that since I started in bibliometrics has been a bit neglected. So a lot of people are always producing more and more indicators, but there's not that much attention paid to actually teaching people how to use them responsibly and when not they should be used. So just to give you a quick overview, I want to talk to you a bit about the background and metrics culture today, and then I'll tell you what we actually mean with metrics literacies and introduce you to research in progress. that we're currently planning. So you probably all know, if you're researchers or just working in scholarly communication, scholarly publishing, that researchers are generally under an enormous pressure to publish. So in their academic careers, what counts, and it's literally counted, is that you produce a high number of publications, and quality is sometimes or more and more neglected because it just counts if you publish more. Another problem is that this kind of metrics culture also uses a lot of simple and very flawed indicators to assess if a researcher or a project actually produces high impact and high quality. So we've heard this before, and Ludo mentioned that we also like to complain about very simple indicators, but we all know that, for example, the impact factor is being misused from being a journal indicator would apply to like publication output of individual researchers. And there's also very simple indicators that are used just as one number, and often we don't even really know what they mean, or they're really flawed. So that is really a huge problem, and you don't really have to look far for the adverse effects that creates. So what happens if we use really simple rankings, the Times Higher Education or other university ranking, the H-index, the impact factor, and so on, is that people's research becomes reduced to a single number, and that creates really adverse effects. And you can see this, you know, in scholarly communication in general, but you also see that in individuals. So I just had a very quick look at social media yesterday. And for example, on ResearchGate, I found somebody asking for what's the passing grade for an H-index in terms of hiring committees. And another person tweeted that although she has been doing really great research and service and so on and teaching, that she'll get reduced to her H-index, which doesn't fully reflect what her work is. So our idea is that we really, really need to improve the way in which metrics are used in academia. And there have been already some resources, and I know both Silvio and Ludo have mentioned the Leiden Manifesto before, because it's been one of the really big milestones in trying to condense the information that the small bibliometrics community has known for decades already, but that kind of gets lost when metrics are used in the wild. And we also have Dora, as Silvio mentioned, that is also there to improve how researchers use metrics in evaluation. Another really great resource is the Metrics Toolkit, which is a website that helps people to understand what different metrics mean. And then there are also two really great books that go into trying to explain what bibliometric indicators are to a more general audience. But what all of these resources, although they're really great first steps, what they have in common is that they're often lengthy reads. So it takes people to pay attention to text to read it, and that usually takes a really long time. And that's time that usually researchers don't have because they're already overwhelmed by their own literature in the field. So why would we expect them to also read a whole book on responsible research metrics? So our idea is that why not use more efficient and effective multimedia resources, like we see them on YouTube, for example. Minute Physics is a good example, but there's so many other short videos that try to explain really complex topics to a general audience. So we want to apply this and create open educational resources for researchers and research administrators to explain different metrics. So coming back to what metrics literacies really are. So we define metrics literacies as an integrated set of competencies, dispositions, and knowledge that empower individuals to recognize, interpret, critically assess, and effectively and ethically use scholarly metrics. And the whole point of this project is that we want to improve the understanding and the appropriate use of scholarly metrics in academia. And how do we want to do that? Well, we want to develop these multimedia resources to support metrics literacy. So we're looking at different types of videos, so animated videos, stop motion videos, also interviews. We might do podcast infographics or interactive resources. And we're actually trying to test which format is the ideal one and most effective one to teach researchers and research administrators. And we're doing this by using a randomized control trial. So we're actually keeping the content constant and just changing the format and randomly having people look at these to test what is better, an animated video or an infographic. And in the end, we want to disseminate those the most effective materials as open educational resources, so we can actually spread that information and people reuse it. I'm not doing this alone, so I have a whole project team, and I'm really proud that we don't only have a really strong core team of doing this mixed method research, but we also have bibliometric experts as well as media production experts and a really strong community outreach team on there. So they're really helping us with all the different steps in the project. So this is kind of our knowledge to action framework that shows the different phases. So what we're doing right now is that we're trying to select based on a systematic review, select the most suitable formats, multimedia formats to create this open educational resources. And we have a film professor, for example, YouTuber, and a podcast host to help us make them really professional. And then phase 2 is the randomized control trial to really test the effectiveness of the different formats. And in the end, we want to disseminate those OERs, and we also want to then see how they do in the wild. So we're going to collect views and citations and mentions and things like that of those OERs. And then we hope that we reduce metrics misuse and just increase metrics literacies overall. So the phase 2 here just shows that we're using a randomized control trial, and we're basically testing the effectiveness by doing an attitude survey regarding different metrics before and after, and a knowledge test after to see which open educational resource format is most effective. And I should say that because we have to keep the content constant, because we just want to measure the variable of format, we're doing this with one particular indicator to start with, and that's the H-index, because we think that's one of the most problematic indicator and also most popular. So the H-index has been used everywhere. When you open your Google Scholar profile, you get your H-index, and Web of Science, you get your H-index. And there are lots of flaws associated with it. And it really stands for this reduction of a whole research efforts to just one number. So we created what we call an H-index briefing note, which addresses lots of different issues that this indicator has. And it's basically the common way of how researchers communicate. So it's a lengthy text document with lots of resources and references to the literature. And that is the basis for creating the open educational resources. But it also works as the control in the randomized control trial. So we can actually see in the end, well, is our hypothesis right that multimedia formats are more effective and efficient than text, because we are actually using the text as a control. So when we did the research on using multimedia formats and trying to educate researchers and research administrators online, again and again, we came across that storytelling is really important. So it's really good to get people the facts, but they just pay more attention, and attention is the one scarcity that we have. We don't have the time to, read lengthy books if this is not our area of study. So storytelling was really important, like keeping those resources short and interesting and engaging people. So we used design thinking to develop personas, and this is very much still a research in progress. That's why you see 2 sketches here by Isabel Dorsch that I almost completed, and 1 in progress, and 2 that we haven't tackled yet. But we did create 5 different personas, and they're supposed to represent researchers from different career stages. So we have a PhD student, a postdoc, a pre-tenure and tenured professor, and a dean. And they all come from different countries. So we really want to emphasize cultural and ethnic diversity here, but they also all come from different disciplines, because we know that research metrics are being used differently in different fields. And we're kind of using these personas to tell a story and have researchers identify with them. So to give you an example of the storytelling here, I just took our persona Mariam, who is a postdoc in biotechnology from Iran, who's currently looking for a faculty position in Canada. And we have her tell a story about what she thinks about the H-index. So she thinks that it's actually quite confusing because she doesn't really know what it measures at all. And she thinks that it's not fair to reduce a researcher's output or a researcher to a single number. And she thinks you don't have to have dozens of articles to be a good researcher. She saw that her H-index on Google Scholar was 2, and it's actually so low because she's only published 3 papers, one of which was really highly cited, but the last one has only been cited once. So here I want to give you a very quick example of what we're trying to do. And be aware of this is just a draft. So this video I created on the floor of my office just at the beginning of lockdown. So it's a really rough way, and we're still trying to get funding now to make this more professional. So this should just give you an idea of what we want to do. So using this Lego stop motion format, we can not only use the storytelling to show what Mariam's H-index is and what the problem with the H-index is, but we can actually visualize her publication output here in orange, and then the associated citations with it. And in the end, you see that the H-index only reduces it to these 2 publications that have at least 2 citations. So just to show you again, we hope that this is a really efficient and effective way, and also an engaging and fun way to explain what this metric means, and also that it really reduces the output. So in conclusion, what we think we need is to really emphasize the education of researchers from all different fields at different career stages, from different countries and backgrounds, as well as research administrators that are often the ones that actually compile the statistics, or what Ludo referred to, like create those rankings and numbers to make decisions in the end. We really need to help them in terms of getting educated and using research metrics responsibly and appropriately. And we really think that storytelling and personas can help to draw attention to our open educational resources. And we know from the literature in general in digital education or digital literacy that they really help to increase the retention too. So people remember something that identify with and something that is audiovisual much more than text. So we know that they are more efficient and effective, and that's why we think we should apply them to the education about scholiometrics. And since this is very much still a research in progress, we would love to hear from all of you participants. So if you have, shouldn't take more than 2 or 3 minutes. If you have some feedback for us here under the link bit.ly/metricslit, there are a few questions just to hear what you think about the personas that we use, the storytelling approach, and what kind of format you would like to see, so videos or infographics and so on. And we have done this before, presented this before, and we got so much great feedback already to improve our personas. So it would be really great to get some of your feedback in this, or in the chat of the webinar as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefanie. I have to say I'm incredibly impressed by how complementary the 3 presentations were, addressing the entire data flow from the preliminary analysis through to its use and dissemination, and attempting to get the message through to the decision makers. So I'm going to start with a question from Olesia Merlblod. And the question is, have you thought about other kinds of crowdsourcing? For example, to start something like Falschmob to invite everybody to add a piece of information using some web resource and so on, or an online game. And this can be really efficient. So Silvio and anybody else.
Well, yes, we have talked a lot about this kind of crowdsourcing for getting data. Honestly, we run also some experiments locally in, let's say, physical workshop with a bunch of people, so 20 people, to see if can works as an approach, and the results that we have got seem reasonably promising. However, for getting a huge mass of citation data, these things should be systematic. So I agree that an online game that anyone in the world can access to, providing this data, can be efficient and for getting this data. But the problem is that it is very difficult. I'm not an expert in this area, and it is very difficult right now to figure it out how to create this game in a way that attract a huge amount of people in doing that specific job. So yes, will be great, but it's something that we didn't have the effort to study appropriately, at least in the past years.
Any further comments from Stefanie and Ludo on this question? Okay, in that case, I would like to move to a question which was addressed to, if I can find it here, let's go on, which was addressed to Ludo. Oh, here we are, from Victor Venema. And it's a question I was also thinking, is there convincing scientific evidence that research assessment of any kind speeds up scientific progress? And is it worth the time of the reviewers and the managers, and worth the perverse incentives any assessment sets? In other words, a number of science foundations are moving towards almost random selection of equally ranked projects. Ludo.
Yes, yeah, that's a fascinating question, of course. For me, it depends, of course, a bit on how you understand the notion of evaluation or assessment. But for me, you cannot do without, because in the end, you need at some point to make decisions, to make choices. And any such decision or choice requires, in some sense, an evaluation that might be in a very explicit way, but otherwise it will be in a more implicit way. So I think you cannot really do without. The question is, of course, indeed very interesting. Should we evaluate the way we do it right now, for instance, in the funding context, or could we, at least in certain situations, could we do things in much simpler ways? Perhaps we don't need to evaluate on a yearly basis. It can be done once every 5 years, for instance, or indeed this idea of randomization in the case of funding proposals. This, I think, are really important questions to study. I'm myself, for instance, part of the Research on Research Institute, where we work together with funders to study this particular question about randomization. So the idea of partly making funding decisions based on randomness rather than based on in-depth assessments of proposals. However, I do want to emphasize that even in those proposals that are now actually already being explored by some research funders, there is still a preliminary stage where the lowest quality proposals are being removed from the selection procedure. So even there you see that some way of actually making choices and doing evaluation is still necessary. But I do agree with the person asking this question that these are the interesting questions that we really need to study in a much more systematic way. And we should not indeed just take it for granted that we indeed always need to calculate these metrics or need to do extensive peer review evaluation exercises. It seems quite likely that sometimes it's at least not really efficient to do so, and it might also be counterproductive in other ways.
Any further comments from the panelists on this issue?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I mean, completely agree with what Ludo said, but it's also something that is really hard to test, right? So is one mode more effective than the other? Because we cannot just switch and randomly say, okay, this year we'll just give money away randomly, and next year we'll look how that works differently. So we're always bound to, you know, measuring what is happening in reality. But it's a really good thought experiment, and I think it's really good to question the way that we are doing things. And the same goes, for example, if you just go into open peer review, which is getting more and more common now, but it's still being tested. And there is the underlying idea that yes, if you know the referee is known or the peer review text is made available online, this would lead to much better reviews because people pay more attention, and we probably get less reviewers number 2 that are really mean because now their name is attached to it. But even this thing and making just slight nuances and slight differences needs to also be tested, because there might be negative repercussions too. So if, for example, if you're thinking about completely open peer review, if you're an early career researcher, you don't, like, it might affect your career if you're now negatively reviewing a senior peer's paper, and you might want to get a job in the future from them or their colleagues, right? So I think even those small changes need to be tested, and the journal Ludo is the editor on, and I'm on the editorial board, Quantitative Science Studies. They're currently implementing a test for a period of time to see what the effects are on open peer review. So I think it's really important to be skeptical and test things, but it's also often very hard to make those changes and test the efficiency or effectiveness.
Maybe I can just follow that up with a secondary question to Ludo, in that he had those nature statistics. And throughout all of these processes, and we've seen a lot of graphs today, we always kind of assume that the correct answer is a Gaussian distribution of result. Is there any evidence that that is actually the case?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of evidence that this is not the case, that many of these distributions are indeed non-Gaussian and not a little bit different from a Gaussian distribution, but completely different, highly skewed. So that was indeed also in the impact factor discussion. That is one of the arguments put forward for showing these distributions. Yeah, this is an important, also one of the important issues in the discussions about metrics, that the data is tends to be skewed. Actually, that's one of the reasons why the Hirsch index was originally proposed in this way. The argument was, let's make something that is extremely robust to highly cited publications, and well, it is indeed, but it also has some downsides, of course. But we should all keep that in mind, indeed. These skewed distributions.
I think we need to be careful about the vocabulary, because we tend to interpret a skewed distribution in terms of outliers in the data, and that is probably not the correct interpretation.
Yeah, I agree.
So I'd like to move to a question for Stefanie now, from Alicia again. It's a long question, so I'll condense it a little if I may. Is it possible to say that low metric culture produced not one, but two kinds of misusers? Those who want to have one magic number, for example, a university management team, and those who claim that all metrics are the creation of the devil. Stefanie. Yeah,
really, really good question. And I certainly, those two extreme cases that Alicia is mentioning are probably the two ends of what I see more as a spectrum, because what we're also seeing, for example, with the H-index does vary from, you know, which is probably not even misuse, but just inappropriate use in terms of like, the researchers just don't know better. Like, it's so ingrained in their culture that they've been told, you need a certain H-index, or, you know, you're comparing people with different H-index, and they just hear like, oh, for my tenure application or for promotion decision or whatever, people want to see this, and then people with higher metrics, those that do well, tend to actually use them more, right? Because it works for them. So I think there's definitely that side where researchers just don't know better and they just go with what everybody else does. And I don't blame them either. That's the whole topic of what I'm saying. Like, we have really neglected this part of informing them. And I don't expect somebody in cancer research to take the time and to read a whole book on research evaluation, because I'd rather have them focus on cancer research, right? So there's definitely this more like this, they don't know better. And then you have the other side of the spectrum of people using it to their advantage. And yes, obviously you also have people who say like, go away with any metrics. They don't make any sense, which, you know, as a bibliometrician, I obviously see some value in those metrics if they're used appropriately and not reduced to one. And it's what Alicia says about, yes, in social science and humanities, it's much more common. So this persona that we're creating, George, our full professor from the UK, he actually has this issue, and thank you to Mike Thelwell, who is a professor in the UK and has talked to many people in the humanities who helped us review the persona, who brought up that in English literature, for example, lots of citations are actually seen in a bad way, because then you're probably studying a topic like Shakespeare that everybody's worked on, and it's just like the popular stuff and it's not real scholarship. But if you are actually focusing on something really, really important, but it's such a niche, then you don't get that many citations. So there's even like a reverse way of saying not only metrics don't work, but we don't even want to use citations as an indicator, because they just seem to show popularity and not so much the value, right? So I think there are all different kinds of facets of how people misuse because they don't know better, or not use at all, over to really the gaming the system part. And I think we have to address all of them. And we're hoping that with our different personas that all have a kind of different attitude towards metrics, we can capture this a bit better, and trying to convince those ones that are, just not better informed, to the ones that are maybe currently engaging in like improving or optimizing their metrics up to gaming. So that's a really, really good point. And I think especially the part with the differences between disciplines is huge here.
Further comments? Can I follow this up again? In that these personas, I think, are actually very good in getting the message over. How will you then make the next step to address the closed room bodies, the evaluation committees and the appointments committees, which tend to be dominated by established academics rather than by research administrators? And the usual response from an established academic when they see the scatter diagrams that Ludo was presenting is to put their head in their hands and say, we're going to do it the way we've always done it. How do we overcome this barrier?
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest challenge, right? Like, we're focusing on producing something fun, engaging, and very efficient, to say like, okay, we're only using up 5 minutes of your time to educate you about this one metric, and down the road, we're hoping to create a whole variety of like addressing all different metrics, creating also, I mean, the takeaway of our H-index case study is also just don't use the H-index, but we do want to offer information about metrics that we think are more useful. The biggest challenge, and that's kind of the third phase that I mentioned, is really based on community outreach. So we have a whole science communicators team to reach out to those decision makers who are, well, those are mostly the ones where time is most scarce, right? Like, they don't have the time to really get into things. And that's also why they probably love a very simple ranking that just tells them, okay, here you have candidate number 1, 2, 3, and you just decide where the cutoff is. So this is a really big challenge, but we're trying to promote this topic and the open educational resources in academic journals, but also like more like academic magazines, let's say, like that are often read by administrators, where that's more general about scholarly communication or the academy. And social media, of course, too. So we're hoping that the wider these OERs are spread, that they do come across the desks of those decision makers. But you're absolutely right. It's the biggest challenge to convince the people on top. But we also think that, grassroots wise, if we go from bottom up, if we convince also the younger generations, that takes a lot of time, but in the long haul, that things will hopefully change for the better.
Could support that entirely. Okay. I'd like to return now to some questions on open citations, but I'd like to throw them to the entire panel, but to Silvio first. And there are 3 questions here which I think actually impact upon all of the panelists. They are you planning to launch a citation metric, creating yet another discussion point? There's a technical question about DOIs and publication dates for uploading to open citations. And from Lutz Bornmann, a question: at what level should citation data be made accessible in the research assessment process? So I think if Silvio could answer those questions, especially from the open citation side, then Ludo on how it might be incorporated into the Leiden analysis more fully in the future, and finally how these can be incorporated into the research assessment process, in that citations are used usually in a very naive manner at present. So, Silvio.
Okay, so to answer the first question about the launch of citation metrics. So our goal, honestly, is to provide citation data and API for accessing them. So there are already available a bunch of calls to the API that can retrieve a number, like in this particular case, the citation count of an article, for instance. So it's a very basic counting. It's nothing impressive, let's say, but we just provide that information. Then it's up to the particular user right now to develop sort of application by using the API. I just want to share quickly a thing by using my browser here. This is a call to the Open Citation API here, that for a given DOI is a call to the citation count operation that basically takes the DOI and returns how many citations this DOI has received. So it's just a number, and we provide this information among the others, and this information has been used by services like the Open Access Helper here that allow you to add information to a journal that is shown on Safari in this case by using exactly that number coming from the API for creating some sort of service there. So this is honestly what we expect, honestly, to offer to the public. We are not providers of rocket science metrics, okay? We are provider of data and of some counts that can be used more easily for then allow people to building software or metrics or whatever. This for answer the question. I don't remember the other one right now. See, about the DOI and the publication date, if I remember correctly, there was that's technical one. So I don't remember who asked that, but the question was basically if we need mandatorily to offer to Open Citation also the publication dates for being ingested in our data sets, since publication dates are available in existing systems. So the point is the following one is not necessary. So the software that we have developed that starts from a very simple CSV file of 4 columns with the citing DOI, cited DOI, let's say, and publication date of the citing, publication date of the cited articles, can be incomplete for what concerns the dates. So if there are no dates specified, we automatically try to retrieve them by querying Crossref, DataCite, so existing services out there in order to populate it. So it's up to the person that want to provide this information to include the dates or not. The point here is that usually in these services, often we have only, it's not always like that, but we have only the year of publication. So if you want to provide the full date, for instance, of publication of a certain article, is more effective usually to specify it explicitly. I know that this means spending a lot of additional time to fill it up, this CSV that we then ingest. But if you don't specify the dates, we can do without them, and we try to retrieve them automatically using existing services.
Thank you. Now, further responses from the panel on the citations, metrics, and usage. Ludo.
Yeah, perhaps I could say something about that. So I believe the work done by Silvio is really extremely important, and indeed it enables us to calculate citation metrics. That's good, that's fine, that can be helpful. But why it is really important is because it will enable us to contextualize these metrics in the sense of making it possible to also see what is behind them. So that was, of course, the point that I was trying to make. It can be done visually, can be done by showing these distributions, as I showed for the journal metrics. But in the end, also, it should be possible to see what is behind these distributions, behind these visualizations. You want this to be fully transparent, so that people making decisions could, if necessary, and in many cases they will not find this necessary, but when it is necessary, they could really get a deeper understanding of what the metrics really tell them, how they have actually emerged from the underlying data. And this requires the data to be open, because with closed data sources, we can to some extent do this, but only in the tools that the providers of these data sources make available to us. And these tools in many respects are okay and are helpful, but they impose all kinds of limitations, and we cannot really move beyond these limitations because the licenses for the data don't allow us to do that. So open citations gives full flexibility and means that all of us, we are in the position ourselves to decide how we want to make use of citation metrics. And some of us may decide, I will just create a metric and that's all I need. And others may disagree and may say, no, that's irresponsible. I want to see what's behind these metrics, and that's fine, but we should all be able to make our own choices.
Thank you.
I want to maybe,
Stefanie?
just add, so I'm also wearing another hat with working on data citations. So I'm working with DataCite and the Make Data Count project, where we're looking at what kind of role data sets or open data is playing. And that it's similar in terms of people are always asking us, are you going to make available metrics? What can we use? What are the indicators? But we have similar problems there too, that we can only work with the data that we can kind of collect. And there's this issue that a lot of researchers don't formally cite data sets, or they don't even share them, or they just mention them in the full text. So there's also this danger of making metrics available that have a lot of underlying restrictions. And I think it's really important that we try to avoid mistakes of the past that create more and more biases, but that we're transparent about how incomplete this data is. And that often, especially with nice shiny dashboard tools and rankings, all those underlying problems get lost, because in the end, even if, as bibliometricians, we always add footnotes, like this shows this, but it doesn't capture this, and we're only capturing journal articles and not covering this part. In the end, people only look at the ranking itself or the graph itself, and all these problems get lost. So I think we have to, and I think this applies similarly to the open citation part as well. We have to be more transparent about the limitations and not, I guess, gloss over them.
If I may add a thing here, I think that limitations, I agree with you, Stefanie. An important thing that we do on daily basis at Open Citation, which at least allow to kind of understand the full chain of the workflow that has been used to produce the data, is to keep track of provenance. This is something that we do because we believe that this is a crucial, actually. It's not enough to say that we publish open citation data. It's crucial to know which software did you use to get the original source, what was the owner of the original source, when you get it. All these information are fundamental in order to build let's say the full path that allow us to expose these open citation data there. Or in case, I don't know, for some reason, a specific information related to a certain entity changed for any reason, like a citation has been removed and substituted with another one. All these things, all these modification in time must be tracked and must be exposed, because you need to provide to anyone tools for reconstruct the full story of a specific entity and the data that are associated to it. And this is something I don't publicize it honestly in presentation, because it's a very technical thing in my opinion, but it is something that we are doing since the beginning, keeping track of how our data changes, and what are the sources that have been used that resulted in that change, and who did it and when did it, are crucial information for making them available for the public. It's something that we publish together with our data. We have also provenance data there, but no one cares about them, honestly, not as much as the data, because provenance is something that you need really if you have a specific issue with data.
There's quite an interesting new question come in, which from Monica Lamba, which is not to do with the issue that Stefanie raised about misuse of data through ignorance or design, but with attempting to manipulate the primary data sources, for example, by adding or removing papers from Google Scholar. I guess that starts with Silvio. What are the checks and balances which are built into your use, for example, of Crossref to ensure that data are not skewed by manipulation by the authors?
So let's say we are using so far what we call trusted source. So we believe that Crossref is a trusted source. All the data that Crossref makes available are coming from the publisher themselves, not by the authors. And something that can be perceived also as a limit of Crossref, but Crossref doesn't allow external users to modify, even correct, that's the problem sometimes, their data. So the point is that we have to trust the publishers here, because the publishers are those ones that really provide the data. And hopefully, since if I provide good metadata, I basically expose several different paths of access to my own articles, I have a great interest of doing it well. So for Crossref, we don't do anything honestly in checking their data sources, because they are doing that process that to us is something that can be defined as trustable. Of course, though, we have also another process that is another Open Citation Index that we call crowdsource of Open Citation Index, that in principle allow us to ingest information, citation information from anyone that want to allow us to ingest them. Here the point is that of provenance. We are not doing explicit, let's say explicit checks on the data that we have, beside the normal one, seeing if the DOI really exists, then the result, so there is something out there with that name, but we are not checking the citations there. We're just uploading them in this specific crowdsourced index, but we keep track of provenance. So we know who have provided this data original, when they have been provided the data. So if you don't trust that guy, if you are one of our user and you don't trust the guy who provided the raw data that we have ingested, you can simply say, well, I don't consider this data as trustable. And I use the rest. So this is the approach. We are really based on provenance as a design principle for making all the information available to a user for using our data.
Thank you. I'll put the same question to Ludo now, because it seems to me the Leiden ranking may be a little bit more sensitive to manipulation of this nature.
Well, in the Leiden ranking, we rely on Web of Science data, and Web of Science has all kinds of procedures in place to make decisions on which journals to include in their databases. So we basically rely on the choices they make, although we do some additional things on top of that. I think what you see is that this is a valuable service that is provided, for instance, by Web of Science. Scopus from Elsevier is doing a similar thing. So they help us indeed to make these kind of choices between what in some sense you do want to include and what you don't want to include. There is, however, also a problem, and that is that I think what we see with these data sources, they do two things at the same time. On the one hand, they create indeed a data source, and at the same time they do the filtering, so deciding what should count, what should not. In itself, both of them, each of these two things is valuable and important, but it would be better, and that is also the model that I think Silvio is advocating, to keep them separate. So to have indeed data sources being produced basically as comprehensively as possible, and then having separately from that, having parties that in some way provide information on what you may or may not want to include in particular analysis. And when you decouple these two choices, you become much more flexible. So now basically we need to do, for instance, what Web of Science does. And as I said, I think they make, in principle, they do a good service by doing this, but sometimes you may not agree with their choices. But then there's no alternative. You have to basically go with the choices they have made, and that sometimes feels uneasy.
Maybe to just add from this point too, that now we have for a long time, and it has been the Web of Science, and Scopus has been around for a long time too. But now we also have these kind of new kids on the block, like Dimensions, for example, and they capture everything that has a DOI. And so maybe going into Manika's direction, it's maybe one more step removed, but we see already that a lot of predatory publishers, they have DOIs, right? Because they know a DOI is usually considered a higher quality. But again, they have them, so they will be captured in Dimensions. So that's also something to take into account, that the less filters you have, of course, the higher your scores will be, and people usually like that. So that's why they go with Google Scholar as opposed to Web of Science when they want to present their H-index. But in bibliometrics, the bigger is not always the better. So it makes sense to have these filters that Ludo talked about in place. And I really like the I4C approach to, be transparent, and so you can trace back, and depending on what you want to use the data for, you can make those decisions of what you want to use and what you want to trust.
Can I follow that through with a question to all of you? There is, of course, the full bibliometric analysis, which gives you an overview of the global output of a person. There is an increasing trend in funding agencies and evaluation bodies to ask researchers to identify their 5 best publications. Isn't that doing exactly what Manika is asking here? Because of course the researcher selects the 5, usually the 5 highest cited publications. Do you have any views on that as to whether that can also skew the evaluation process?
So I actually had to do this recently for a grant application here too. So in Canada, it's quite, you have to select your 5 most valuable outputs. And I think it's actually a good point, because for me, my most highly cited work is not usually what I consider the most valuable, right? And the nice thing about selecting them, at least here in Canada with the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, you actually write about it. So you don't only list them, but you actually get some room, like a couple of paragraphs, to say, why do you consider this particularly good work? And I think that is something that complements the metric itself. And I still think the researcher is in the best spot to make this pre-selection, to say what they consider has been the best of what they've done, right? So it helps the reviewers to not have to go through maybe 30, 40, or 50 outputs, but helps them focus on these selections. And also it might change with the grant application, right? So if I'm currently applying for a grant for the Metrics Literacies project, so I'm selecting 5 different ones than I would for a project that is related to research data, right? So it always depends on the context, and I think the selection is usually better because it takes away from the ranking and the numbering and provides more context.
There's a follow-up comment here from Manika, which relates to both the provenance and the data which is included. That she identifies that many databases are not actually included, and that many types of output are simply not incorporated into the established databases. But I think that that's a point that everybody has accepted is a reality that can be improved. There's a final question here for Stefanie from Bibi Chang. She agrees with you, first of all, and she's wondering whether bibliometrics might be counterintuitive to the purpose of open access repositories. Can you shed some light on that?
I'm not sure I understand the question right, but I'll try to go in the direction that I understand it. So actually, I think not at all, because like citation analyses actually have shown over and over again that there is an open access citation advantage. So basically, if you consider two papers that are similar or identical, the one that is open access will get more citations simply because more people are able to read it, right? So you get a broader audience, so your chances of making it into a reference list in the end are higher. And actually, regarding open access repositories, so green open access, most studies actually show that the papers that are published wherever, but then are self-deposited in open access repositories, score the highest citation impact. So even more than golden open access, hybrid open access journals. So I think actually bibliometrics help to bring the point across that sharing your knowledge openly and making it accessible to a largest possible audience is the way to go. So I'm not sure if that was exactly the question. Maybe you can follow up if I was going in the wrong direction.
Okay, so I think we're coming to an end. I will take the moderator's privilege of asking the final question, for which I'd like a very short 30-second answer from each of the panelists. This one is a very simple one. Do you think in 5 years' time we're going to be sitting here debating exactly the same questions and being no further forward in the implementation? Silvio, would you like to start?
I will start. The question is easy. It is the answer that is not exactly. So my hope is that no. I mean, at least for what concerns open scholarly data, we will live in a different world. That will become the normal way of thinking about data for this kind of usage. So I will hope that that won't happen. So the idea is that if we won't have open data that are functional to research assessment, to study how science evolve in time and these kind of things, we have failed with this infrastructure. So I really hope that we are discussing about how these things actually advance research communication instead of talking again of these problems, honestly.
Ludo.
I think the world will be quite different in 5 years from now. So in addition to the points made by Silvio, we also see in the research assessment landscape, we see these developments going on. So I said something about the Netherlands. We have the DORA declaration that was mentioned, which is quite influential. I actually do not agree in full detail with that declaration, but it's clearly going to change things. We saw also in China that, for instance, they are de-emphasizing the journal impact factor. It's of course to be seen what will be the alternative that they are going to introduce, but it does show that things are moving. So in 5 years' time, the conversation will be different. I'm quite confident about that.
Thank you. Stefanie.
So maybe just looking back, I mean, I also hope that in 5 years' time, people don't use the H-index anymore, at least don't reduce people's success to just one number. But looking back of how slow things also move, I'm not that optimistic. I think we'll still be discussing things. I hope that, you know, open citations are now the norm, and all publishers participate. But I still think we'll be debating the same thing, maybe with quite different metrics.
Thank you to all three of you for those comments. I tend to, I agree with all of you, but I think my air of realism means I agree with Stefanie that we will still be debating, but we will be debating something a little bit different. And I suspect we will still be attempting to find ways around the paywalls on institutional basis. So it remains for me now simply to thank the three panelists for an absolutely stimulating set of presentations, to thank all of the attendees for their participation, for their asking the questions. I'd like to wish you all, wherever you are in the world, to keep safe and the very best of success in the rest of your day, the rest of your evening, the rest of your morning, wherever you are coming from. And to remind people that the second Basel Sustainable Publishing Forum in virtual form takes place on the 26th and 27th of October. And the theme is the global transition to open access, challenges and solutions. So with that, unless Charlotte wishes to say anything, it's my pleasure to bring this webinar to an end and wish you all the very greatest success in your bibliometrics, in your metrics, and in your careers. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.